We are back and we are joined once again by friend of the show, Erin Reed, a journalist reporting on LGBTQ plus legislation, news, all of that around the country, proprietor of the Erin in the Morning Substack, which everybody should be reading. Erin, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Of course, thank you for having me on.
So the RNC, pretty transphobic. They're going in on that. Marjorie Taylor Greene was one of the opening speakers at the RNC. Let's watch a little bit of what she had to say. We played this last night on our RNC coverage, but you wrote on your in Erin in the Morning in particular about these comments. This is what, you know, honestly, one of the top Republicans in terms of fundraising. She's powerful. Marjorie Taylor Greene had to say on night one of the RNC.
Promised normalcy and gave us Transgender Visibility Day on Easter Sunday. And let me state this clearly. There are only two genders.
All right, Erin, so there are only two genders, says Marjorie Taylor Greene. But obviously this is a theme. Can you explain the whole Easter Sunday thing? Because that seems to be what the right is obsessing over about this Trans Day of Visibility.
Of course. And, Marjorie Taylor Greene was one of the first big speakers to speak at the RNC this year. And her speech would sort of set the table for what would be a continual deluge of homophobic and transphobic remarks from multiple speakers at the RNC. So this thing that Marjorie Taylor Greene is specifically referring to was Biden's proclamation of Trans Day Visibility on March 31st this year. This is the typical date for a Trans Day of Visibility. Now, the interesting thing is that it fell on the same day as Easter Sunday, and a bunch of Republicans just went up in arms over this, the fact that Easter Sunday was sharing the same day as Trans Day of Visibility. Now, the interesting thing about this is, of course, Easter Sunday is a moving holiday. It moves from date to date to date to date to date. And in fact, if you go back and you look at every single Easter Sunday that has happened since America was founded, there have been more Trans Days of Visibility on March 31st than Easter Sundays on March 31st. And so, regardless, we have a lot of just sort of kerfuffle over the fact that Easter Sunday and Trans Day of Visibility shared the same day this year.
So they're very upset that there was a calendar coincidence, and apparently this is the deep state trying to push DEI on everybody or something like that.
Of course, again, even though we have had Trans Day Visibility on March 31st for years now.
Right. And Marjorie Taylor Greene was not the only speaker at the Republican National Convention to spout off transphobia. This is Ron Johnson. Some of his remarks here, and this was also on night one, which I think that was a part of the theme here, was hating LGBTQ plus people. This is Ron Johnson's remarks, which were reportedly the wrong speech. He didn't do the unity one that they were supposed to pivot to after the assassination attempt on Trump. But regardless, this is what he had to say.
This fringe agenda includes biological males competing against girls, and the sexualization and indoctrination of our children. Today's Democrat agenda, their policies, are a clear and present danger to America, to our institutions, our values, and our people.
All right. So you heard those boos in the crowd. Reaction, Erin, to Ron Johnson's remarks there.
Yes, of course. So, this is a continual use of shrouded language to basically espouse for book bans, as well as bans on LGBTQ clubs in schools, bans on inclusive policies in schools, and more. And in fact, if you look back in history, this has a history. You can actually go back to articles written in the 1990s, the 1980s, and the early 2000s, specifically targeting gay straight alliances in schools, where they used identical language. that these clubs were sexualizing kids and not allowing youth to express their LGBTQ identities in schools, to wear rainbow flags or anything else like that, was akin to sexualizing kids. It's not true. We have inclusive policies in schools specifically so that people can be themselves publicly, so that people can use their names, that people can, hold hands with somebody that they care about. And I think that these statements show that the Republican Party is not backing off from what has been a very, very fiercely anti-LGBTQ agenda. And so far, you've played, 2 of the first day speeches, but this would continue to become a theme in day 2 and day 3. I don't know how many of you watched last night, but we saw Trump Jr., Matt Gaetz. We saw DeSantis come out with anti-LGBTQ policies and statements.
Right. Ron DeSantis was so thrilled to be able to get back to his bread and butter of transphobia, which was a big theme in his campaign. I think he lost for reasons unrelated to that. But, we do see that while the Republicans are bigoted on this front, when transphobia has been at the forefront of some of these campaigns, Republicans haven't had a ton of electoral success running on this. Now, that's separate from state legislation and transphobic legislation that's moving through many, many red states in this country. But when it comes to, governor's races, Senate races, I encourage people to read Ettinger Mentum's piece, which is very long form, The Electoral History of Transphobia. They haven't had too much success, but still the base gets riled up about it.
They do. And of course, as you mentioned, DeSantis ran back home with his tail tucked between his legs after he really ran heavily on this issue. And whenever he did, the Florida Senate told him, we don't want any more of these laws. We're done. And 20 of the bills that targeted LGBTQ people this year in Florida failed in Florida. And the reason for that is because of pieces like you mentioned with the Ettinger mention piece, where we saw that 70% of Moms for Liberty and Project 1776 candidates lost their race. This was a big issue in the Virginia election. This was a big issue in the Michigan election of 2022, in Arizona. I've got actually a pretty long list of elections where this has failed. But I also want to mention that in the last 3 or 4 months, we have seen increasing indications in polling showing that the general public is really not having any of this. We saw, for instance, an LA Times NORC poll just a month ago that showed 77% of people believe that focusing on trans issues and that targeting trans people with anti-trans legislation are a distraction from other issues that people care about. And then a recent Gallup poll showed that 62% of people oppose laws banning gender-affirming care in the United States for trans youth. And so these issues are really losing salience. There aren't a lot of people that that look at this and say, this is what I want my public officials to spend their time on.
Yeah. What do you make of that? Because in covering the RNC, we talked about how in 2004, Bush ran on a constitutional amendment to say that a marriage was between a man and a woman. And that was actually galvanizing. I remember at the time, it was actually the majority opinion, and not there's when you poll different issues, right? It electoral salience can vary because, say, 80+% of Americans want background checks on guns or things like that, or to ban weapons of war. That polls very well, but people don't vote on that. Even when there's some, lack of understanding / bigotry in the public about trans issues, that has not directly related or translated in, actually it's hurt Republicans in many ways at the ballot box. Anti-gay stuff didn't at the time. It's almost like they're using that same playbook. Like, what's your feel for why there's that discrepancy?
There's a few very interesting things to talk about here. And, I do want to point out that back in the early 2000s, if you had polled if people believed that marriage should be between a man and a woman, you would have found that around 66 to 70% of people would say, yes, they believed that. And then within about 10 years, we saw one of the biggest flips in public opinion polling in history, where people then switched their views on that. And now we say 70% of people believe that gay people should be able to get married. And whenever you look at what's happening today, I think that we don't see that salience today specifically because people remember the gay marriage fight. People remember that they changed their minds on gay people. And I think that regardless of what people believe personally over things like trans people in bathrooms, over trans youth care and more, I think that they know that maybe they don't have everything figured out. And that's what we're seeing. You know, regardless of what people believe personally, they don't believe that the government and that government officials should be legislating over this. And furthermore, I think people question themselves more on this now. I really think they do. I think that people are getting to know trans people in their day-to-day lives. And we are no longer the ephemeral, like, trans other. We are now in your families. We're your friends. We're your coworkers. We're your colleagues. And I think that we're going to see more and more of that moving forward.
I think so too. I think the only thing that they were able to play on was like this almost suburban parent anxiety about like, what if I had to put my kid on puberty blockers or on hormones? And that is like, I guess, you know, a fleeting feeling that I think maybe some parents might feel, but is that going to rile up a movement of hatred that's gonna, I don't know, carry Republicans to victory? It appears that that's not the case.
Well, and you can't sustain yourself off of that either. You can't sustain a political movement off of that either, because again, in these suburban communities, their kids are bringing home trans friends. They are
Right.
taking care of one another. And so the parents are learning about trans people. They're seeing trans people in their communities. And, you know, I think about my own suburban community that I live in, and you do see trans people publicly now. And I think that over time, that does have an effect. Just exposure has an effect on how people conceptualize and include the queer and trans people in their day-to-day lives.
You know who doesn't include reportedly a trans person in their day-to-day life is JD Vance. We talked about that last night, how JD Vance has reportedly cut out a longtime friend who he was once supportive of, who sent them home baked goods after they had top surgery. This is here Alejandro Caraballo, who is she still with Media Matters? I don't want to get the outlet wrong, but either way, JD Vance, Sophia Nelson. This is an excerpt from this article. Sophia Nelson, a former classmate who is transgender and was once a close friend of Mr. Vance and his wife, recalled that Mr. Vance delivered home-baked treats when they underwent top surgery, but years of friendship ended in 2021 over his support for an Arkansas bill opposing transgender care for minors. It hurt my feelings when he started saying hateful things about trans people, they said. So that's somebody who used to be friends with JD Vance, who, for, you know, his political ambitions, whatever the case may be, has cut out of his life. But you don't need to take his personal relationships for it. I mean, JD Vance sponsored a Senate bill to ban trans care for trans youth across the country. So this vice president, beyond what I just said, what through your writings have you discovered about Vance's transphobia?
Well, I mean, let's go full circle. And that bill that JD Vance is sponsoring in the Senate right now is the companion bill to Marjorie Taylor Greene's bill. It is the bill that Marjorie Taylor Greene first announced. I believe it was on a Tucker Carlson show a couple years ago, and she's been trying to push it ever since. It is the most extreme anti-trans bill in history. It would create a federal felony ban on gender-affirming care for transgender youth, but it would go further than that. It would bar hospitals, secondary education institutions, which include teaching hospitals as well as medical schools, from teaching about transgender care, period. It effectively erases education on trans people. And it's not just hospitals like trans care for medical care. It would even target psychology graduate programs, psychiatry graduate programs, and more. So this is a very extreme bill, and it's something that he's pushed really heavily. It does not surprise me that he cut a trans person out of his life in Arkansas. What does surprise me is that this was the first anti-trans gender-affirming care ban. Arkansas was the first state to pass this bill. And the governor of Arkansas, the Republican governor of Arkansas, vetoed that bill. So he's an early adopter. He's been in this race for a long time, trying to target queer and trans people.
And you bring up Arkansas here, just to zoom out slightly. I know that on your newsletter, you've been tracking anti-trans legislation and efforts in this election cycle in 2024. What updates can you give to our audience about the status of a lot of these bills throughout the country, and what are some of the most kind of five-alarm fire threats on the state level for trans kids and people in the United States?
Of course. So the first thing to note is that actually this year, the bills are losing steam. They really are. 2023 was harder in terms of bills passed. We've had roughly half the amount of bills passed this year. Part of that now is because many of the states that passed this legislation literally just doesn't have anything else to pass. But there are states like Georgia, for instance, that went to try to pass a bathroom ban, and they failed to do that. We saw it in West Virginia. We saw in Kansas, a Republican cast the deciding vote against the gender-affirming care ban in Kansas. She previously had voted for the bill. And so again, I think that we are seeing even Republicans start to get to know the trans people in their communities. But that said, just because the wildfire is starting to die out does not mean that the embers cannot still burn. And we are seeing things pop up nationally even. Just recently, we saw Senator Joe Manchin essentially approve a trans military ban that would bar transgender surgeries in the military, as well as bar TRICARE from covering trans care for trans youth dependents. And this is huge. This is the first time that a Democrat has supported an anti-trans provision in the military. Now, mind you, it's Senator Manchin. He's technically an independent now, but the bill was voted out of committee by a Democratic group of senators. I do have insight that they are going to be trying to amend that out of the bill, thankfully, but it's pretty scary.
But why are we voting this out of committee? I know that Biden decided to weigh in a few weeks ago with some guidelines that were such unnecessary capitulation to the right on this. Like, what is you're just talking about how it's losing steam and there's no electoral salience. What are the Democrats doing?
Democrats are often scared of their own shadows. And I think that that's something that we all have been aware of. There's been a significant amount of pressure on the Biden administration, on members of Congress to follow the science, to follow the medicine, to listen to our major medical institutions. And I'm really hopeful that, we can continue to push back on this. But the danger is there. We saw in the United Kingdom, for instance, the Labour Party came out fully endorsing anti-trans policies. And so it is essential that we do not rest on our laurels and assume that those who are on our side in the past, potentially, are always going to be that way. And we also need to be aware that the Democratic Party has a history sometimes of throwing minorities under the bus for political gain.
Don't ask, don't tell. I mean, Biden supported don't ask, don't tell, for example. Like, this doesn't need, right. Sorry?
I said, no, this is exactly the case. And so we need to make sure that we are not only putting pressure on those who fiercely oppose our healthcare and our right to exist, but also those who are fair weather allies.
Right. Exactly. You mentioned, and we'll wrap up here, Erin, but the UK and Labour, the Cass report that was commissioned when the Tories were still in power has come under fire. I think we've spoken about this, for a lot of medical misinformation that was kind of undergirding it. Now, what is the status of that report, and are there indications in the UK that under Labour they're going to move forward with using this report to crack down on trans care?
There are indications that Labour is moving forward to at least some degree. I know, for instance, that there was a minister there that had banned puberty blockers, that had extended the puberty blocker ban that was meant to be temporary. They're trying to make it permanent. And so this is a major fear in the United Kingdom. There's also major issues with journalism in the United Kingdom on reporting major issues with the Cass review. We just got a report from the person who leads the Good Law Project in the UK, showing that after the Cass review was published, we saw that there was a spike in suicides after the 2020 restrictions on gender-affirming care in the United Kingdom. There was one suicide the 7 years leading up to those restrictions, and then after that there were 16. And this particular spike in suicides was glossed over by the Cass review. In fact, this is like a 300-page document, and you look and it's mentioned in one single paragraph, and they don't even mention the numbers. And so it's very clear that they were trying to hide the fact that gender affirming care restrictions hurt trans youth. And this is something that we've always known, we see this in every single time they try to ban gender affirming care. We see this in all of the studies. And in fact, we just recently saw in a group of academics, mainly from Yale, the Integrity Project, which is currently hosted on the Yale website. They came out with a large review, essentially rebuking the CAS review for many of the mistakes that it had made in evaluating trans care.
Well, gosh, all right. Well, we'll be keeping. We gotta have you back on to talk about maybe that in particular. Once we're done with this like Republican National Convention crap show. But Erin, I really appreciate you coming on today. You can find Erin's work at Erin In The Morning on Substack. We will put a link to that wherever people are listening to or watching this, and at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me on.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.